Hi, everyone. So far, we have a few attendants, but we're going to go ahead and wait about 5 minutes to let more people trickle in. So bear with us for just a few moments. Hi, everyone. Just want to announce again, we're going to wait just about 2 more minutes and let a few more people go ahead and join the meeting. So please bear with us for just a few more minutes. Okay, it is 6:35 now, so we are going to go ahead and get started with the meeting. So hello, everyone, and thank you for welcoming us into your homes for this virtual community meeting. This is a new format for the Planning Division, and we're happy to see all of you in this space as we continue to seek public input remotely. Also, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be recording this meeting and we will post it to our informational website. So first, I just wanted to start off with a few introductions. My name is Brent Carvalho, and I'm a planner with the City of San Jose Planning Division. I work on the ordinance team, and I'm the project manager for the ordinance work we're presenting here today. I am joined by several of my colleagues. We have Martina Davis, supervising planner for the ordinance and policy team, Jennifer Piozet, supervising planner for the urban village team, Leila Hakamizeda, supervising planner for urban design, Jared Hart, our division manager for citywide, and I believe Michael Brio, deputy director, is also here as well. I also wanted to point out that you may notice at the contact info at the bottom of each slide for counter.public@sanjoseca.gov. If you're experiencing any technical issues throughout the meeting, please go ahead and send an email and we'll try to help you out. So for today's agenda, we've already gone over our introductions, and next I'm going to provide an overview of the work that we'll be presenting here today, including a projected timeline for the ordinance to be approved. Then we'll move into the Q&A section, and I will also briefly go over some of the Zoom functions that you can use to participate, as well as the code of conduct for the Q&A. You can add questions to the Q&A throughout the meeting, but we will hold off on answering them until we open up the public comment. And then after that, we're going to wrap up and talk a little bit about next steps. As a reminder, the intent of this community meeting is to inform owners, residents, and other interested parties about the proposed ordinance, answer questions, and receive public comments. Staff will take notes on the discussion and respond to questions and comments. This is a community meeting. It is not a public hearing. Also, this is a policy update and not a development project. Therefore, no approval or denial of this proposed ordinance will take place today. Eventually, this ordinance will be heard at both the Planning Commission and City Council, and I'll talk a little bit more about the timeline later in the presentation. So to start us off, I wanted to go over a little bit of our project overview, our project objective. This proposed ordinance, we are looking to create 6 zoning districts, which will correlate with existing general plan land use designations that currently lack conforming zoning districts. I'll go into more detail regarding each of these zoning districts throughout the presentation, but these are the names of those 6 districts: Urban Village Commercial, Urban Village, Mixed Use Neighborhood, Mixed Use Commercial, Urban Residential, and Transit Residential. In addition to creating new zoning districts, this ordinance will include minor text edits to improve consistency, as well as adding or clarifying definitions in the zoning. And then before we get started, I wanted to clarify a few things that we are not addressing in this ordinance update. Firstly, we are not proposing changes to the parking requirements at this time. There is a separate comprehensive effort to update parking. Next, this ordinance does not have anything to do with opportunity housing. That is a policy recommendation which came out of the general plan 4-year review task force, and City Council has not voted on it yet or given staff direction on starting that work. We will not be rezoning any properties as part of this scope of work. A separate team of planners will be working on that effort to rezone properties, and that work is slated to begin later in the year. We will also not be making any changes to the pedestrian-oriented zoning district, commonly referred to as Alum Rock form-based zone. And finally, there is no development proposed as part of this ordinance. There are no areas being considered for additional growth. The Envision San Jose 2040 general plan, which included extensive community outreach, has already determined where future growth areas will be developed. The objective of this work is to create rules for what future development will look like. There are two main reasons why the planning department took on this work. The first reason came from the mayor. In his June budget message for fiscal year 2018 to 2019, Mayor Liccardo identified a comprehensive update of the zoning ordinance to align with the general plan as a key action item to facilitate housing development. Around that same time, the California State Legislature had the same idea and passed SB 1333, which became effective in 2019 and requires that charter cities like the City of San Jose bring their zoning ordinance into alignment with their general plan. It just happened to work out that our city council directed us to start this work right around the same time, and that really set us up perfectly to address the changes required by this new state law to create alignment. As a charter city, the City of San Jose has never been required to have the general plan and zoning ordinance be consistent with one another. And wherever the two policies have been inconsistent in the past, the general plan has always superseded. Next, I want to talk broadly about our approach for aligning the general plan and the zoning ordinance and how we've divided the work into multiple phases. Phase 1A, approved by City Council in June of 2019, updated existing zoning districts to better align with the general plan. This work included updating the permitting requirements for a variety of uses across zoning districts, in addition to revising, adding, or deleting text throughout the code to reflect more modern development standards and definitions. Phase 1B, to create new zoning districts to implement high-density residential, mixed use, and urban village general plan land use designations. This refers to the current proposed ordinance that we're presenting here today. After these zoning districts have been created, all of the mixed use and high-density general plan land use designations will have conforming zoning districts, making it possible for these properties to be brought into alignment as part of phase 2 work. And then that brings us to phase 2, which will be the actual rezonings of properties to conform to the general plan land use designations. And as I mentioned, that's going to be with another plan. So to summarize some of our key outcomes that this ordinance will accomplish, it will bring the city into compliance with state law. It creates a pathway for us to comply with Senate Bill 1333. It will also provide certainty and predictability for developers and the community at large, clear objective standards for higher development, and most new districts will allow mixed use development by right. It will also create high quality new development. This ordinance update will create modern standards for development, and these new zoning districts will work together with the recently adopted citywide design standards and guidelines. Important design-related information and regulations can be found in that document, but will apply to development that occurs within these new zoning districts. So for these next few slides, I'm going to define some planning terms that I'll be using throughout the presentation, and then I'm going to talk about the some planning concepts and processes. First off, we have mixed use, which is defined as the combination of commercial and residential uses located on the same property as part of a unified development. Mixed-use development consists of commercial and residential uses integrated either vertically in the same structure or structures, or horizontally on the same development site, where parking, open spaces, and other development features are shared. Next, we have 100% commercial development. Development that is purely commercial in nature. This can be a multi-tenant or single-tenant commercial building. For example, offices with a ground floor, publicly accessible gym. And then we have 100% residential. This refers to development which is purely residential. For example, residential units with a private gym or other amenity on the ground floor, which is only accessible to those residents of that development. And now here are a couple technical planning terms along with some examples. The first definition is floor area ratio, or FAR. This is the ratio of a building's total floor area to the size of the piece of land upon which it is built. One example is a 2,000 square foot house on a 6,000 square foot lot, which has an FAR of 0.33. Another example, the new Adobe Tower downtown, which is currently under construction, is a commercial office building which has an FAR of 10.56. You can see the calculation below. The total FAR, the total floor area is 1,149,367 square feet, and the lot size is 108,900 square feet. And that equals an FAR of 10.56. Another commonly used term is dwelling units per acre, or DU/AC. This is a way of measuring residential density by dividing the number of units by the amount of land those units are built on. One example is that most of our single-family neighborhoods in San Jose are about 6 to 8 dwelling units per acre. And another example is the 88, or Central Place, and that is a mixed-use building located in downtown, and it has a density of 124 dwelling units per acre. You can see the calculation here below. The total number of units in the building is 335, and the total site acreage is 2.71 acres, and that equals 124 dwellings per acre. So next, I'd like to take some time to explain how our development policies work together. The general plan, Envision San Jose 2040 general plan, serves as the constitution for development in our community, and it sets the stage for how, when, and where development can occur. It provides general guidance regarding how the zoning ordinance should regulate development. The general plan includes a land use map and planned growth area map, which lay out where most growth will occur throughout the city. While the urban village and mixed-use land use designations already exist in the general plan, currently there are no urban village or mixed-use zoning districts, which provide development standards to allow the scale of development that the general plan allows. And that really is the reason for this work that we're here talking about today. We're creating zoning districts in order for them to align with the general plan. It's also important to note that just because these zoning districts don't exist today, it doesn't mean that development won't or can't occur in these areas. Development could still occur through a planned development permit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that through a couple examples later on. Next, we have the approved urban village plan. The general plan also includes a major strategy for future growth, which involves creating urban village plans. The urban village plans are related to specific areas of the city and further refine how development should occur in order to achieve walkable, bicycle-friendly, and transit-oriented neighborhoods with a mix of commercial and residential uses. And then we have the zoning ordinance, also referred to as Title 20 of the Municipal Code, which implements the general plan by setting the specific standards for development on each property. Every parcel in the city of San Jose is assigned a zoning district, and that zoning district provides controls on the form and placement of buildings on individual parcels. Some examples of those controls are building height, setbacks, and private open space requirements. And then finally, we have the citywide design standards and guidelines, which were just adopted by the City Council on February 24th. And this document will provide fine-grained regulations for how buildings will look and feel in the built environment. So a great example of how the development policy hierarchy works in practice is our collective policies for private and common open spaces. Before I get into that example, I'd like to just quickly define what private open space and common open space refer to. Private open space is basically space that is adjacent to a residential unit and is available only to the occupants of that residential unit. This will occur in the form of a balcony or a backyard or something like that. And then common open space refers to the collective space that is available to all of the tenants of a development. So it might be a courtyard, it might have a swimming pool, it might be a plaza, something like that, that's basically accessible to everyone in that development. So to start looking at the general plan, Chapter 4 provides general guidance for public open space and recreation, but it also includes references to private and common open space with general direction on accessibility from residential units. Then the urban village plans provide a hybrid of general plan policies and zoning ordinance development standards. Not all the plans have the same requirements, and some may focus less on these types of open space, particularly if there is already good access to open space in the neighborhood. They will always only apply to the specific geographic area defined by that urban village plan. And then we have the example of our new urban village and mixed use zoning districts, which we're proposing here today. These provide specific requirements for private and common open space, and that requirement is dependent on the total number of residential units being proposed in a development. For example, a 100% residential development requires 40 square feet of private open space per unit and 75 square feet of common open space per unit. A mixed-use development requires 30 square feet of private open space per unit and 50 square feet of common open space per unit. Then finally, again, we have the citywide design standards and guidelines, which provide standards on the design, placement, and orientation of the private and common open spaces in relation to the overall development project. Next, I want to talk about some of the permit requirements that will be applied in the new zoning districts. The official use table is still being finalized. However, the preliminary draft included a reference to the commercial pedestrian zoning district for examples of what you might expect to see in the new zoning districts. In addition to that, I wanted to provide a couple of examples of updates you might see in the final draft. So for example, historically, mixed use development in commercial zones has required a conditional use permit, which is approved by the Planning Commission. And mixed use development in residential zones requires a special use permit, which is approved through a director's hearing. Mixed use development in our new zoning districts, excluding urban village commercial, which is a purely commercial zoning district, will require a site development permit, which is also approved through a director's hearing. They will still require public noticing and a public hearing. However, I want to make it clear that some recent state laws, which are meant to streamline housing production, allow projects to move forward without a public hearing or noticing if they meet certain criteria for affordable housing, as long as it's consistent with what's allowed by the general plan. This next slide refers specifically to the mixed-use neighborhood zoning district, which we're proposing here today. Currently, duplexes are permitted in our R2 and RM zones and require a site development. Townhouses and row houses or small lot subdivisions are typically approved through a planned development zoning and planned development permit. The planned development zoning must go to the Planning Commission and Council for approval, followed by a planned development permit that is approved by the Director of Planning at a director's hearing. A site development permit is approved at the director's hearing. The new mixed-use neighborhood zoning district will allow all of these housing development types to be approved through a site development permit. This will still require public noticing and public hearing. And again, I just want to emphasize that some recent state laws, which are meant to streamline housing production, allow projects to move forward without public hearings or noticing if they meet certain criteria for affordable housing and if it's consistent with the general plan. And now we also have this example of the planned development zoning and permit, or PD permit. This process is commonly used for townhouses, row houses, and allows the project to create customized development standards. The planned development zoning is approved by City Council and the PD permit is approved through the Director's Hearing. Both can be concurrently approved by City Council. Most likely, wherever you've seen townhouses throughout the city, they likely went through the planned development process. And that is because our zoning ordinance doesn't have standards which can facilitate that type of development. A great example of this is Communications Hill, where you can see a variety of townhouses and single-family small lot homes. And now I've mentioned the term urban villages a few times, and we talked about how it's a major strategy for growth, but you may still be wondering what exactly is an urban village. Urban villages shown in the map with dark blue outlines are shown in the map with dark blue outlines. These areas bring housing, retail, and jobs together with high density mixed-use development. Urban villages promote options for walking, bicycling, and transit use to support sustainable and healthful communities. There are 61 urban villages in total. Currently, 12 of the urban village plans have been approved, and you can see that they are colored green on the map. There are also 2 urban village plans which are currently in the planning process. Those are colored orange on the map, and those are the Berryessa Bark Urban Village and the North First Street Urban Village. Over time, our urban villages will accommodate 64,000 new homes and 116,000 jobs throughout the city. The urban village concept really brings together core objectives of the city strategies for health, sustainability, greenhouse gas reduction, and economic development. This ordinance work will help create zoning districts which will facilitate this growth, both inside and outside of urban villages, by providing regulations for higher density development. And now I'm going to turn it over to Martina to provide some specific details about each of our new zones.
All right, hi everybody. So I'm going to give you guys some examples of what development might look like and where you can expect to find it based on our current general plan designations. I'm also going to provide you with a side-by-side comparison to help give an idea of how these proposed zoning districts are going to implement the objectives of our general plan. So before we do that, I wanted to quickly explain this map. So this map is showing citywide where all of those general plan designations that we're talking about, that we're creating the zoning districts for, exist. The idea behind this map is we definitely understand it's a big picture view, so I don't expect you to look at this to be able to figure out where this is in relation to your house or whatnot, but just wanted to give a kind of the bigger picture view of where this stuff is spread out throughout the city. And we have online maps that are you can put your address in, scroll around, zoom in and whatnot, and we'll provide you the links to those later. So again, this is just the high level overview of where these designations are, which will show us where the properties will be zoned with these new zoning districts. Next slide, please, Brent. All right, so I'm going to go through each of our proposed zoning districts one by one, and you'll notice that I'm starting with the more intense ones and bringing it down to the least intense ones. So you'll see a little bit of a pattern there. I'm going to start out with our Urban Village Commercial District. This will implement the Urban Village Commercial Land Use Designation and will only exist within urban village areas with an adopted urban village plan. Development under this designation should adopt an urban and pedestrian oriented form and provide minimal parking and automobile circulation that's adjacent to the street. So as you can see, the general plan does not permit residential development in these areas, and that control has been carried over into our zoning district. So this would be a zoning district where only non-residential uses would be allowed. No residential or mixed uses would be, mixed use development with residential would be allowed. You can see the floor area ratio is consistent with what is permitted in the general plan, so no changes there. And if you remember our example, the new Adobe Tower was a little bit over a 10 FAR. So just to give you a little bit of context, and we'll show you some pictures in a second as well to give you some ideas of what this might look like. And then for building height, because these zoning districts will only be allowed in urban village growth areas, it is through that urban village planning process that the appropriate building heights will be determined. If a project were to be proposed in a designated urban village before an urban village plan was completed, then the maximum height would default to 120 feet. This default number actually comes from the existing allowances in our code for what the height within urban village areas. So that's where we came up with that as the default, as it does reflect our existing code. And you're probably wondering where you can expect to see some of this development. So we'll show you where this urban village commercial general plan designation exists within the next slide. Thank you, Brent. So again, to quickly note, these maps are just to really give you kind of a big picture overview of where this exists in the city, not to be that in-depth, figuring out, is this on my property or my neighbor's property? And we'll give you those tools to do that later. And you can see that the Urban Village Commercial General Plan designation is primarily located in Western San Jose in some of our planned urban villages. So everywhere you see this designation has had an urban village plan approved to further dial in what could or could not be allowed on these properties. And so you'll see, for example, Stevens Creek, that kind of line to the left, that's Stevens Creek, Winchester, West San Carlos, Valley Fair, Santana Row, South Bascom, and the Alameda is where you see this designation right now. And next slide. And so here's some photo examples of the Urban Village Commercial Zoning District. The one on the left is, you may recognize it, it's the Samsung campus up in North San Jose. It's a large building, but in relation to the whole site, it has a lot of open space and is also very open and accessible to the public, even including a public coffee shop. And then the building on the right is the new Adobe Tower, and it actually represents probably higher than the high end, because as you remember, our example was this one has an FAR of about 10, and this general plan designation and thereby the zoning district would cap you out at about 8. So this is actually even a little bit more intense than what you would see likely within this designation and future zoning district, but we wanted to kind of give you something on the higher range to show you. And next slide, please. Okay, so our next zoning district is going to be the Urban Village Zoning District, and it will implement the Urban Village General Plan designation. So for the most part, where we have that Urban Village designation is where in the future you will see the Urban Village Zoning District. And again, it's going to, in the future, be within urban village plans with an adopted plan by the council. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on that in a second. But first, let's go through the uses, density, floor area, and height. So as you can see, this district is pretty flexible in what can be built there. It could be mixed use, it could be 100% residential, or it could be 100% commercial development. And when we say commercial, that could also include things like institutional uses like hospitals or schools, so that kind of stuff. The density or dwelling units per acre is set to a maximum of 250. And one thing to note is that if someone is building a mixed use development that or 100% residential development, there's actually a minimum of 55 units to the acre. And so that would be the lower end of what we would expect to see in urban village. And so to give you a rough estimate, that's about a 4 to 5 story building. It's 55 units to the acre. There's an allowable FAR of up to 10. So again, the Adobe Tower, that was an example of one that's about 10. And you can see that that is carried over into the zoning district. And then as similar to the urban village commercial, you would default or defer to the adopted urban village plan for the maximum building heights, because that planning process will kind of establish some more specifics around the heights within that urban village area. And if and where not specified, it's 120 feet. Next slide. So you'll see it exists within urban village areas. So that's what those little blue lines represent. For the most part, it exists within urban villages with a planned area. There is a couple of caveats, and Brent, you can maybe point to them with your pointer as I talk about them. There's the Rincon South specific plan area. So that was a specific plan that was absorbed into the general plan as an urban village. The specific plan in a lot of ways is very much like an urban village. It has that sort of more fine-grained detail of what could or could not occur within that area. So this one kind of had that urban village planning process long before we called them that. And again, it was absorbed into the general plan. So you'll see that urban village general plan designation within the Rincon South area. You'll also notice there's a big chunk of it up there on Berryessa Bart. That is designated as an urban village, and actually council is scheduled to review and make a decision on that urban village plan pretty soon. This was a Horizon 1 urban village, which meant we're going to plan it kind of early on in the process, and actually pre our current general plan and before the urban village concept, it had already been planned for some pretty significant urban village style growth. So this is one example of where you will see the urban village designation, not in a planned urban village, although that plan is almost complete. And then on our south end, very similar to the Berryessa Bart, that's actually our Blossom Hill Road Hitachi urban village, the Lowe's, the Target, all those new kind of apartments and townhomes down there. And so very similar, this was an area that was planned for urban village style growth long before we had that urban village concept. And pretty much that entire area actually is covered by a planned development zoning, which again is kind of a project specific zoning, and it acts very much like an urban village plan. It has that same level of kind of detail, breaking it down in certain sub areas, what can and cannot be allowed. So when we adopted the new general plan, understanding that this area already had effectively what looked like an urban village plan, we had it designated as urban village. But that area actually, it's pretty much already developed as what it is planned for. So that's an example of, although it has this designation, we wouldn't really expect to see a lot of new development because they really did just develop that area with some decently high density development. And then finally, we have the Alum Rock Urban Village, which is home to the pedestrian oriented zoning or form-based code, as we call it sometimes, that went through an extensive outreach process before the zoning districts were formally applied to the site. And the development standards for this section of Alum Rock were adopted into the code around the same time as adoption of the general plan. And kind of similar concept is that that zoning district was really written in conjunction with a lot of community input and outreach. And it actually does kind of get into a lot more specifics that are designed around the specifics of the Alum Rock Avenue. So it also functions as a type of urban village plan. And next slide, please. And here's just some examples. We wanted to give for each of these examples something kind of on the higher end and then something on probably the lower end of what you'll see. So you'll see on the left, it is an example of the 88, again known as Central Place. We mentioned that earlier in our dwelling units, the acre example. It's located downtown. So this is really something that's kind of on the higher end of what we would expect to see in urban village. And then on the right, you see a newer, I believe that's a senior housing development. I could be wrong. But it's a newer development in the Japantown area, and that kind of represents the lower end of the density range that you would expect to see within the urban village zoning districts. All right, move on to the next one. All right, so the next one is our transit residential zoning district. This implements, of course, the transit residential general plan designation. You will see a pattern here. The zoning district will be applied both inside and outside of urban village areas. So a little bit different from the urban village designations I just talked about. Those would only be applied within urban village areas. These could be outside. And you'll see this supports pretty high density residential or mixed use development. It's not too dissimilar to the urban village designation in that way. Generally, it's transit residential. The name kind of gives you a clue. It's generally in areas that are close proximity to transit. It also supports standalone intensive commercial or employment uses, offices, retail, hotel, private community gathering facilities, again, other kind of institutional uses, churches, schools, hospitals, that kind of thing. So the residential density allowed by the general plan is 50 to 250 units to the acre. Again, not too dissimilar to urban village. And you can see we've carried that over into our proposed zoning districts. And if you do, mixed use development, there is a minimum of 50 units to the acre. Same thing, you'll see again, the floor area ratio of 2 to 12, we're carrying that over into our proposed zoning district. So that's what the general plan sets as kind of the intensity of development. And then for the height, the maximum building height in this district, we are proposing right now is up to 200 feet. You can see the general plan says development would be around 5 to 20 stories in this, or excuse me, 25 stories. We actually did get some feedback after we had this meeting earlier. We just want to give people a couple options on time, and someone mentioned that you can't really build 25 stories in 200 feet. So just want to note, we'll probably be looking at adjusting that number to make sure it's consistent with what the general plan allows for. So let's do the next slide. And you can see, it's a pretty intensive designation. So you can see there's not a ton of it in the city. It is, as I said before, in close proximity to existing public transportation, such as light rail and Caltrain. You see a big kind of box of it, chunk of it up north in North San Jose. That's actually almost all of that is already developed with kind of higher density apartments. It's that North Park development for the most part. So that's an example of where we have this designation that reflects the existing development, not so much that we expect somebody to tear those apartments down to build new apartments of this, around the same size. You can see that we have some urban residential within the North First, and then a lot of it within the Diridon area due to the proximity to light rail and Caltrain, along with some along the Capitol Avenue near the light rail. And kind of down in South San Jose, you'll see it. That actually also kind of correlates with light rail stations. And again, this is the one that appears probably the least frequently of all the designations we're talking about today. And we'll go to the next slide with some examples. And similar examples as urban village, something to the left on the lower end. These are both mixed use examples that have ground floor retail type uses and then residential units above. The one on the right, you may recognize it. It's the One South Market building in San Jose, or excuse me, in downtown San Jose. And again, it really reflects the higher end of the size and density range that we would expect to see within this transit residential general plan designation and future zoning district. And let's go on to the next one. All right, so urban residential. So as I said, we're going to get, go from the highest density to down to lower densities. So we have our urban residential general plan designation and proposed zoning district. So the general plans existing in the zoning district would implement that general plan designation. And again, this can occur both inside and outside of planned urban village areas. It supports medium to higher density residential development, mixed use development, or a broad range of standalone commercial uses, including retail, hospitals, institution uses, etc. So the general plan density is a little bit lower than the one I just talked about. The range is around 30 to 95 units to the acre. So you'll see that carried over in our proposed zoning district. Same thing with the floor area ratio. You'll notice it's a little bit, probably significantly lower, about 1:4 floor area ratio. And again, we're proposing to carry that over into the zoning standards. And then the height is 3 to 12 stories in the general plan. So that equates to up to 135 feet, although if with all of these designations, if you're within an urban village area and the urban village specifies something different, you would defer to that. I will note with this one, kind of interestingly, is that there's a lot of building code changes that trigger when a building is over 85 feet tall. And so once you go over 85 feet, you actually have to go much, much taller to make it pencil out typically. And so we actually think that although we would allow up to 135, that's kind of within that sort of dead zone where it's not tall enough to make sense, but it's a little too tall to where it's very, very expensive to build. And so we suspect that we'll likely see the urban residential zoning district top out at about 85 feet on buildings, just as a natural kind of, not as a regulation, but as something that happens naturally given some of those code considerations. So I just wanted to mention that. And then let's go to the map. So you'll see we have more urban residential general plan designation, which is where the zoning would go in the future. You can see a lot of it correlates again with our planned urban villages out in West San Jose. Some of it up in North San Jose, some of that, actually a lot of that in North San Jose, if not all of it, is reflective of existing development within this density range. So again, just because you see these things on the map doesn't necessarily mean that we would expect to see them redevelop. A lot of them actually represent development that's already consistent with these designations and future zoning districts. Let's see if I want, yeah, okay, let's go on the next one. And similar, very similar examples. Again, kind of the lower end, about 4-story. This one looks like 100% residential building. The higher end, we have a picture of the vintage towers in San Jose. That was actually an old office building that was converted to housing about 20 years ago. And that's around the kind of higher end of the height and density we would expect to see within the urban residential zoning district. And let's go to the next one. We got almost done, I promise. We got 2 more. All right, so next one is mixed use commercial. And again, this implements the mixed use commercial general plan designation. So we're proposing a mixed use commercial zoning. This allows a mix of commercial and residential uses with an emphasis on the commercial activity and residential in a secondary role. So unlike a lot of the other districts, this one you cannot do just 100% residential projects. If you're going to add residential uses within this zoning district, it would have to be in the format of a mixed use development with that also contains commercial or employment uses. So you'll see once again, the densities are matching with what the general plan calls for. The proposed zonings would implement that by having the same up to 50 units to the acre. And again, only in a mixed use format, so you can't do just straight residential. Same thing, the floor area ratio, you'll notice a match 0.25 to 0.45 for 100% commercial, and then 0.5 to 0.45 for mixed use development. So it's a decent range. As a reminder, you know, like a normal single family house in San Jose is actually probably around the 0.25 range, just for some kind of concept. It's a lower density. So there's a good range that would be allowed within this district and designation. And the height, 1 to 6 stories. And so we're proposing about 85 feet or up to 85 feet is consistent with the 1 to 6 stories. And same thing as before, if there's an urban village plan that specifies, you would defer to the urban village plan. And let's go to the next one. So you'll see this in some of our planned urban villages in West San Jose, as well as outside of it, and it largely correlates with existing commercial areas. And when the general plan was adopted, the idea was that, you know, maybe those areas could have some kind of infill development where people start introducing maybe apartments or stuff above the commercial, but they would still maintain their commercial character. So you'll see, for example, there's some on North 13th Street with this designation. I believe that's Keys Road, parts of West San Carlos or Stevens Creek as well. And then a couple other places mixed throughout the city. Let's go to our examples. And again, similar examples in this one to the left. These are both, you know, on the lower range. You're not seeing high rises here by any means. On the left is an example of ground floor retail with apartments or condominiums above. The right is an example of an office building that also has some ground floor retail. So that's kind of the intensity and type of development that you would most likely expect to see within this future zoning district. And next one. All right, so we're going to end this recap of our zoning districts with our last one, which is the mixed use neighborhood general plan designation and the proposed zoning district that would implement that. So this again would be applied both inside and outside of urban village planned areas. It's intended for infill development of townhouses or kind of smaller lot single family homes, maybe the type of homes that share a driveway, for example. It also supports infill development at medium density duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, and you could also do live work or some small standalone commercial development within this designation. This is our lowest intensity designation. It allows up to 30 units to the acre. And so our proposed zoning would as well. The floor area ratio, you see we're carrying over the 0.25 to the 2.0. And then the height is within the general plan, says 1 to 3.5 stories. So that would equate to about 45 feet. And I'm going to give you on the next slide, let's go to the next one, and we'll go through a little bit more detail. So this is an interesting one because it allows, you know, a broad variety of kind of the lower density housing types that are above just your normal standard single family, but not, you know, the larger big apartment building kind of things. And so we do in San Jose actually have a lot of experience with this zoning, this type of development. You see townhouses everywhere. Communications Hill is a good example. And so based on our experience and knowing that there's a whole ton of different types of things, duplexes, single family, townhouses, row houses that are allowed, we identified that two different paths to build under this based on what someone is proposing to build. And so you'll see, the idea is we're trying to right size the type of development with what somebody wants to build. So if you're building single family houses, the height's a little bit lower, so we don't end up with really, really funny looking, super tall houses. Whereas if you're going to do multifamily over commercial, it would make sense to go a little bit taller, right? So that's where you'll see that sort of variety moving across based on what someone is proposing to build. You'll see the same thing with the number of stories and then the open space, right? If you're doing a single family house, yeah, you typically have a little bit bigger of a yard. So we would look for that. Whereas if you're doing, say, multifamily, you might be able to do a little bit less balconies and stuff like that. And let's go to the next slide to show, I think it's the map. Next slide. Okay, so this you'll see in a lot more places, and actually for the most part, it's outside of urban village areas. The idea is it's sort of a transition between those higher density uses and then kind of our lower density single family neighborhoods. The other thing that's pretty unique about this one, unlike any of the other ones, is by and large, almost entirely, where it's designated is already built with the type of development it is called for. So if you actually, when you go and pull up our interactive general plan map and start, browsing around and looking at it, chances are you see this mixed use neighborhood, you're already going to see townhomes, you're already going to see apartments, you're already going to see that kind of up to 30 units to the acre style development. So we don't expect to see a ton of new development. I don't want you to look at this map and think, oh my gosh, tomorrow there's going to be new townhouses in all these areas. For the most part, it's already developed, and this is reflective of what's already developed. Of course, there will be some opportunities for infill projects here and there, but again, we don't expect to see huge, large-scale new development in this designation. And let's go to our photo examples. All right, so some examples, and these are both San Jose examples. The one on the left are some townhomes that are built right off of the Evergreen Village Square. The example on the right is some single family small lot homes. It's hard to tell from this picture, which is kind of the point, is that driveway actually leads to a couple more houses in the back. This is in Nagley Park, so that idea behind that is it kind of fits within that neighborhood. They just look like your normal size house. Let's go to the next slide. More examples. So as I mentioned, there is the opportunity to do small 100% commercial development within this district. So here we have an example of a converted house to a coffee shop that was possible. This example on the right is, I want to say that it's outside of Japantown. It's an example of a duplex, right? It kind of looks like a single family house, similar character and feel, but it is 2 units, one on top of another. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brent to close us up, and then we'll move on to Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Martina. That was nice for me to rest my voice. Appreciate your help. So just want to give everyone an idea of our projected timeline for this work. Starting with the first community meeting that we had back in November 12th of 2020. After that, we posted a draft on our informational website on December 15th, and that's been available for the public for a couple months now. And that brings us to today's community meeting. We've had 2 community meetings today. It's been a very long day for us. Thank you, team. And next up, we have our Airport Land Use Commission. That is tentatively set for March 24th, followed up by the Planning Commission, which again is tentatively set for April 28th. And then that will be followed by the City Council hearing on May 11th. So before we jump into our public comment section, I just wanted to bring our project objective here front and center again to remind us all, what our project objective is and what the scope of this work is involving. I've also added some links here. This is a link to our general plan map, our zoning map, and also our citywide design standards and guidelines. We're going to make this PowerPoint available on our informational website, so you will have access to these resources. And now I want to just go over quickly some of the Zoom functions for our public comment. Everyone's going to be placed on mute until you are called upon. You should be able to type your questions into the Q&A function. If you're joining us by phone and you need to raise your hand, you can press *9, and that will allow us to recognize you as having a question. Speakers will be called upon by staff and then asked to unmute. And depending on the number of speakers, we will probably be limiting your time to speak and possibly maybe only allow you to speak once. Also, just want to remind everyone, this meeting is going to be recorded and will be available on our informational website sometime next week. And also just want to throw up here our general code of conduct for our meeting. Just want to give everyone an opportunity to read through the rules, the general expectations, the gist of it, as we all want to give respect to each other and allow time for us to all give comments and take your feedback. So with that, I'm going to open up the Q&A, and I'm going to have some help asking the questions, and we will get through as many as we can. If we don't have time for all of the questions, we can always follow up later with an email. But with that, let's turn this over to the Q&A. So Jennifer, can you help
Absolutely
queue up our first question?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jennifer Piazza. Once again, I'm the supervising planner over our urban village efforts, and my partner here, Alex, who works on ordinance team, is going to be helping me in the background get all of your questions queued up. So what we're going to do first is call on those who've raised their hands in the Zoom app. And then we've been keeping track of the Q&A. And we're also going to read through those questions and have staff answer them. So if you're more comfortable speaking and would like to raise your hand, please use the raise hand that's at the bottom of your Zoom window, or press *9. If you're calling in, I see we have that one call-in user. If you'd rather type up your question, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A on the Q&A button on the bottom, and we will get through them. So we're starting with the raise hands. So Ramona, I'm going to allow you to speak. Please unmute your device and ask your question. You'll have 2 minutes to ask. Ramona, you're able to unmute. All right, we're going to come back to you. So we're going to head over to, we don't have any other raised hands here. We're going to go to our Q&A. So the first one that we have is from David. So these new designations will pertain to the existing urban village plans and future urban village plans, i.e. the 70 urban villages envisioned across the city, correct? And the reason that the only form-based zone corridor is excluded is because it does not constitute an urban village plan, correct?
So I'll go ahead and take a crack at answering that question, but I might also ask Jennifer to give us some clarity. So yes, urban village plans that are already approved do have many of the general plan land use designations, which correlate with our new zoning districts. And in the future, those properties will be able to be rezoned so that their general plan and their zoning districts are aligned, are in conformance. And many of the districts, as Martina described, exist outside of urban villages. And so similarly, those will also be aligned. With regards to the Elm Rock Urban Village, that is designated as an urban village. As Martina mentioned, the zoning districts were created before or around the same time as the general plan being adopted. And so it did go through an extensive community outreach process for the zoning districts. And so they basically were applied, and then it was considered an urban village through that process. So Jennifer, if you don't mind kind of speaking to clarify anything that I may have muddied up.
Sure. So our urban village plans that are adopted, as many that are on the call were part of those processes, we only changed the general plan designations. We did not, as part of those processes, bring the zoning ordinance in alignment. And so you may still have adopted urban village plans, but if someone comes in to develop their property, they still need to rezone their property to bring it into conformance. So part of what Brent is doing is creating new districts that better reflect what is in these urban village plans at a better scale. And then our citywide rezoning team, that's not their official title, but for sake of this call, they will be undergoing a comprehensive effort to bring things in alignment. As we've mentioned with state law, we're required to now align our zoning and our general plan. These rezoning efforts will not affect the general plan designations that were decided through those community-based processes of the urban village plans themselves. And in a place where the zoning district has perhaps a different standard, like for setbacks, for example, and the urban village plan has a different standard, that urban village plan will take precedence over what the zoning says. So all of the work that was done and all the feedback received from the community is still upheld. But if the urban village plan is silent, then the zoning districts will fill in that gap. And if we didn't answer your question in entirety, please let us know today. So we're going to move back over to our raised hands. Todd Williams, please unmute your device.
Hi, I'm wondering about the community outreach regarding, because this seems like a drastic project to have a 12 to 20 store building built next to your house. And I only perchance stumbled on this meeting on Nextdoor, but it doesn't seem like there's been any outreach to the affected neighborhoods besides general outreach. Now, another thing I'm wondering about is you're changing, it sounds like the plan is to change all zoning to match the 2040 general plan, but it was almost like a safety net for neighborhoods that the zoning had to be changed, was a red flag that this is something that's going to happen, because otherwise you don't know. If you change the zoning, it'll just be built without the neighborhoods even knowing, because this meeting wasn't advertised to the neighborhoods that are going to be affected. So let me know.
Thank you for your question, your comments, Todd. So just to recap a little bit, this zoning ordinance, we have had a series of community meetings. There was 2 today. There was 1 back in November. So there has been public outreach for this ordinance, and the preliminary draft has been available on our informational website for about 2 months now. And as I mentioned early on in the presentation, there are no development projects being proposed as part of the scope of work of this zoning ordinance. And because of that, you don't need to worry about a project that's popping up next door to you. When something, or if something is proposed in your neighborhood, it will likely still require a site development permit, and that will involve public noticing and a public hearing. And the one caveat with that might be related to whether or not affordable housing is developed, is part of that proposed development, where there are streamlining laws at the state level, which would allow an affordable housing project that meets very specific criteria and that conforms with the general plan requirements to move forward without public noticing or a public hearing. So that is the one example of a development where you might not get that type of noticing that you're used to, but also kind of just to let you know, with these changes to citywide ordinances, we don't notice them. You don't get a mailer. So it's posted on the website, it's posted to the calendar. We don't proactively mail to every resident in the city of San Jose.
And then let me just add to that is that, as we said earlier, this work is just creating the text of these districts. There's another team working on actually rezoning property to these districts. Those rezoning actions will include notification to the neighbors. So if your neighboring property is getting rezoned to, say, urban residential, you will actually receive a notice when that happens. Right now, we're just writing the text of what those zoning districts say. We're not applying them on the property in that way yet, if that helps clarify.
Great, thanks. And I would also like to just note in general that these projects are still subject to our public outreach policy. So many of them, if they'd have to have a community meeting when their hearing body was a planning commission, they would still have to hold that same community meeting if their hearing body is the planning director. So if the council policy requires that community meeting, they will still have to provide that unless they go through one of these ministerial processes, meaning under state law, they do not need to have a public process for affordable housing. So we're going to take another call-in user and then we're going to bounce back to Q&A. Shihana, please unmute yourself. I see you've unmute yourself. Please ask your question. Shihana, could you please try again? We can't hear you.
Hello?
There we go.
Okay, great. What is driving these plans? Is it influenced by builders versus residents in the area? And the other questions I have is the water requirements to supply these multi-story buildings, which already we're struggling with, the electricity requirements and the heat generated by all these massive structures. And finally, I don't think there are enough jobs to call for these giant structures, because San Jose and Santa Clara is losing jobs at a tremendous rate. And there's with globalization, it's losing at such a rate that I don't know what these plans are going to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shihana. I'll go ahead and take a crack at answering some of your questions. With regards to what's driving these plans, the planned urban villages are community-based plans. So there is outreach involved. And so any development that exists within an urban village area, there will be community outreach. And so it's actually a combination of developers, the market forces, and community members like yourself that participate in those urban village planning processes. And that's what helps determine what's appropriate for each of those urban village planning areas. Some of your questions about water regulations and electricity, I'm not really sure how to answer that. Maybe, I don't know if Jared or Martina would like to comment on that.
Yeah, so let me just clarify. So kind of what is driving all this growth? It's the general plans for growth, right? So we know our area is going to grow. We know more people are coming in here, and we're actually required by state law to plan for growth. So every city must adopt a general plan. Every general plan must plan for a certain number of units. And so our general plan already does that. So as we said earlier, this project wouldn't be introducing new growth into areas that weren't already planned for growth. What we're doing here is just setting the rules around that already planned growth. So that's kind of an important distinction there. And it actually goes to your question about water and energy. So when we plan for growth at the general plan level and we plan for all of these units and all these jobs and all of that, that's where we do that water supply and that energy analysis. So if you actually wanted to look it up, our general plan EIR does say, we're planning for all of these units. This is where the water is coming from. There was a water supply analysis. There was an analysis on impacts to services and such as, utilities, water, water power, that kind of stuff, greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah, that is planned for, but essentially that's already been planned for. And what we're doing here is just setting the more fine-tuned rules around that growth that's already been effectively approved by our council when we adopted that general plan.
Great, thank you. Should I move to
Well,
the
so I
next?
was also just going to say, so you did mention something about not enough jobs, and I don't know if Jared or Martina, you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that, so right now, the project we're doing right now is actually focused on these residential zoning districts. So when you hear us talk about residential, and not jobs, is actually because we have, frankly, the zoning districts for jobs much more developed. And so we're doing that for residential now. But yeah, when you hear our presentation and all you're hearing is us talking about residential, that's because really that is all what we're talking about today. That doesn't mean that we don't have jobs planned, but doesn't mean we don't have zoning districts for jobs. These are just our zoning districts that focus mostly on our residential growth and what it's going to look like.
Great. So our next question is, how does this activity align with the general plan amendment process?
Jared, do you want to go ahead and answer this question?
Sure. Thanks, Brent. Yeah, so in terms of how this would align with the general plan amendment process, if an applicant submitted a general plan amendment to redesignate a property to one of the land use designations in which these new zoning districts are being created to implement, there would need to be a subsequent rezoning along with that general plan amendment to one of the new zoning districts, so that the proposed general plan land use designation and zoning are in alignment. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, please, raise your hand, or you can type back in a follow-up question.
The next question is, how is near transit defined? Near Caltrain, light rail, buses?
Again, I'm not, I don't have a great answer for that. Jared, do you mind providing an answer for that?
Sure, I think, and I think we had another question too about the proximity, or there was a question about proximity with transit residential. So I think this question is related. Oh no, this is the question I'm saying now. Yeah, so the general plan doesn't actually define the radius in terms of that applying that general plan designation. It basically says, it describes it as typically being located in close proximity to transit, jobs, amenities, and services. So we don't have a specifically defined radius in which that land use designation can or cannot be located. I think typically it is located in areas near transit. I know during the presentation there was a slide that showed where that designation is located. And it'd be something that we'd look at if there was a proposed general plan amendment. We would look at the appropriateness of the location of the proposed transit residential land use designation, but there's not a specific a specific radius that's identified in the general plan.
Thank you. Let's see. So the next one is, if a developer plans to use an affordable housing density bonus, can it still go through the director's hearing, or will it need additional approvals?
That sounds like a great question for Martina. Can you
The answer is yeah. So the density bonus, the way it works is it's processed concurrently with the process that you need to go through for your project. So it's essentially like a tack-on application. So if a developer was submitting a site development permit, they would also submit their density bonus request, and those would be reviewed concurrently and have, say, like the director's hearing in the case of a site development permit. So whatever permit process kind of the underlying use requires. So for example, I don't know, single room occupancy, we tend to require a conditional use permit for that. If someone wanted to use a density bonus, it would be through that conditional use permit process. But it's the density bonus itself does not trigger additional hearings or process. It's done with the normal process.
So the next question is, for mixed use commercial, why have 0.25 versus 0.5 FAR for commercial versus mixed use? So there's a couple questions embedded, so let's go one at a time. There's the first.
Yeah, Jared, do you want to go ahead and answer this one?
Sure. Yeah. So the mixed use commercial land use designation is primarily a commercial land use designation that allows for some residential, but it really is primarily a commercial land use designation, which is why for 100% commercial use, the minimum FAR is set at 0.25, and for mixed use residential commercial project, that commercial FAR is set at a higher level at the 0.5 FAR to ensure that the project includes a significant amount of commercial.
Transit residential versus urban village zoning district. There's a 55 versus a 50 dwelling units per acre or minimum. Why not make them the same? What's the benefit to the difference?
And again, I mean, I think we're going to kick all of these to Jared, because here's the thing is, if you noticed, we're kind of bound by what the general plan says. So our goal and actually our mandate under state law is to bring the zoning into conformance with the general plan. So where you see those kind of those kind of questions, it's because that's the existing general plan language. So I just want to kind of provide that context as to kind of why we're kicking these over to Jared, and he can sort of explain some of the reasoning behind the general plan designations, which is when those decisions were effectively made.
Right, and yeah, and that's correct in terms of the reasoning for the zoning districts and the defined densities that we're proposing. It really is to align with those land use designations. In terms of transit residential versus urban village zoning district, 55 to 50. I mean, that was by a decision that was made during the adoption of the general plan back in 2011, in terms of what the kind of the right lower in terms of the lower minimum density, what made the most sense at that time. But then we're carrying it forward with these zoning districts.
Great, and then the final of this set, why less open space per unit for mixed use? It's on one of the first slides.
I think we kind of
that.
wanted to, just help incentivize mixed use development. So, but Martina, if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, it's effectively, it's the same thing, just to elaborate on that. So actually to the point about jobs, if you crack open our general plan, you'll see it really is a jobs first general plan. And it is actually a lot more expensive to build mixed use development than just straight residential development. And when developers are given the choice, they tend to lean towards residential only if they're, able to select. And we really like to see the ground floor retail. Everyone wants a coffee shop on the corner and that kind of thing. So the idea behind that is to try to incentivize and make it a little bit easier if you're going to provide that ground floor, that sort of mixed use space. You could use, you have a little bit less space that you need to devote to private open space. Another thing we hear really kind of interesting is providing private open space is actually very expensive for developers as well. So that can be a really kind of big incentive to do that. And the idea is if you got, say, like a coffee shop or something in the ground floor of your building, you have a little bit more space that may not be open, but space that's open to everybody. So it's kind of the idea behind that.
Great, thank you. The next question is, Martina, I think you might be able to answer this one. Does San Jose have a complete historic site building inventory? And when will it be completed, and how does it fit into the urban village timeline?
That's a great question. I cannot answer that fully, but I don't know, some of you may remember, I used to be our historic preservation officer. So historic preservation is near and dear to my heart. Yeah, the honest answer is no. San Jose does not have a completed historic resources inventory. We have certain areas are a lot more completed than others, and we are very, very aware of this. If you're into historic preservation and you haven't met him already, we have a new historic preservation officer. His name is Vikram. He is extremely experienced. He comes to us from, I think, Pasadena, which is one of our highest, best historic preservation cities in our state, really. So that is kind of one of his, if not his primary task, is to complete and update our historic resources inventory. So we are working on that. The timeline for that, I can't speak to that. We can always follow up and get you more information or connect you to Vikram. Just let us know and you can kind of delve into that. But I will say, generally speaking, as we're looking at the urban village plans, we are now, especially when we have more resources toward preservation with him here, that we are kind of prioritizing urban village, or areas that we plan for growth are going to be prioritized as the first ones we're going to work on updating the inventory for. So the idea is, you know, where we expect to see development is where we're going to focus our resources, is identifying our historic resources. Hope that answered your question, but if you want more follow-up, again, we can always connect you with her.
And to support what Martina's saying, when my team is applying for urban village, for grants to plan our urban villages, we work with our historic preservation officer, so Vikram, to see if we should be conducting our own survey that would supplement his work when we're doing land use planning, so we can keep in mind the historic resources that we have available in the villages to determine what level of protections we'd want to apply and what his team would then carry out. So another question, with the move away from planning commission to planning director, will the planning director hearings be moved to evening so more community members may participate? What % or fraction of planning commission items will be eliminated by this move? And what will the planning commission still work on?
So thank you for that question. To my knowledge, no, the director's hearing will not be moved to the evening time. And I don't have an idea of a percentage of work that will be shifting away from planning commission to director's hearing, but items that are heard at the director's hearing, I believe, are appealed to the planning commission. So any really controversial projects or things that maybe have kind of issues, the planning commission will then ultimately be the authority on that. And so I don't know, Martina or Jared, if you want to comment on that as well.
And just to add, one of the things the Planning Commission will still do is look at all our policy work, right? So anytime we update the general plan or update the zoning ordinance, that does get heard by the Planning Commission, who makes a recommendation to the council. The idea is that the Planning Commission is weighing in more on the policy level, and the individual project levels where they're consistent with the policy may not need to go to the Planning Commission. That's kind of the concept behind it. And as Brent said, though, anything that is controversial would get appealed to the Planning Commission, and they would be the final decision-making body. So that's where their role is. And I will say also, we are, no promises, because Brent is absolutely right. I haven't heard of any conversations around this, but, it's good feedback on the time of the director's hearing. And I think there is a lot of kind of ongoing conversations in the city around outreach and whatnot. So I think, your comment is heard. I will just say that. No promises, but that's a good comment.
Thank you, Martina. How do you change the general plan to align more with what current residents desire?
So Jared, would you like to go ahead and answer that one?
Sure. Yeah. So, to be clear, just this project is really about creating zoning districts to align with the general plan. But to your question, a property owner or anyone for that matter can apply for a general plan amendment to change whether it be the land use designation on a particular property, or even the text within the general plan. We also, as part of the urban village planning process, as we go through those neighborhood plans and developing those plans through the community outreach process. We also look at changing the land use designations within those urban villages through that process.
Great, thanks, Jared. So we're coming close to time, but we only have a couple more questions, Brent, if we have the thumbs up to keep going.
We do actually have more time. The meeting actually will end at 8:30. So if there's more,
Perfect.
if there's more questions, we definitely have one.
Perfect. All right, so the next one, have any recommendations proposed by the current Envision 2044 year review task force conflicted with what is being proposed in these 6 zoning district definitions?
Not to my knowledge, but I'm going to go ahead and kick that over to Jared to answer.
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. Good question. And no, yeah, the proposed zoning districts, there shouldn't be any conflict that at least that I'm aware of or can think of with the recommendations coming out of the general plan 4-year review.
Okay. Before we get to the next question, I want to acknowledge a comment made in the Q&A that appeals are very limited. So not realistic that you suggest that the public has that option. The planning director meeting excludes the public by having it at 9 a.m. So the last question that's in the Q&A is, did you consider this report for proposing changes to the general plan near transit? And there's a report linked, staff. Looks like it's an SJSU, so San Jose State University, a TOD park and ride report of some sort. So bear with us for a moment while we open it, I suppose.
Yeah, and so I also will probably ask Jared to follow up on this question.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the link, Roland. We will definitely take a look at that. Again, it's part of this process. We're not proposing any general plan amendment or any general plan changes in terms of changes to land use throughout the city, and it's kind of connects with the previous question. Again, probably where we really look at changing the land use designations is through our urban village planning process or other neighborhood plans, and beyond that, then it's typically going to be developer driven in terms of development applications or general plan amendments that the city may receive. But we'll take a look at the link and definitely we'll look at that. Thank you.
All right, so it was asked earlier about public notification. I believe that there are nearly 78,000 San Jose residents who live within these villages. With the amount of money you will have to spend on studies exploring, would it not have been best to better properly notify every resident that these changes could potentially affect their lives? Many of my neighbors do not know anything about these plans, and I can speak for all of the other neighborhoods. And I can't speak for all the other neighborhoods throughout the urban village plan. Not all residents have computer access.
So I'll probably ask Jared or Martina to also chime in on this, but again, I just want to restate that there are no development projects that are being proposed as part of this ordinance. As we've said multiple times, we are basically trying to create the rules and regulations which will inform future development, which will involve public noticing and public hearings. So if Martina or Jennifer or Jared, if you have any other additional comments you'd like to add to that, please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, and actually maybe Jennifer or Jared can speak, because I will say, so the urban village plans, those are done on the general plan level. And so that, they're a little bit higher level than the work we're talking today. And those do involve notification. So we do, when we're working on an urban village plan, we typically have several community meetings. And I believe we do mail notifications, but I think maybe Jennifer or Jared can elaborate on how we do notify people when we are working on urban village plans, which is a little bit different than the citywide work. That's just creating the text in a book and not necessarily applying it to property.
I would split this, my answer into 2 buckets. So the first bucket is, how did these areas become urban villages to begin with? Because that's a very common question that comes up with planning. And many of these areas were designated as part of the outreach process with the original general plan like, gosh, I believe they started around 2008 through 2011 to do the planning effort for the 2040 general plan, which is what we're working on now, as implementing that. And the grand bargain, as it's called, was for the city to grow, because we're required to grow. We have new residents and new jobs that we have to plan for. We would not intensify our existing single family and lower density areas. We also would not grow into our foothills. We would have our urban growth boundary, not go past it. We wouldn't develop Coyote Valley. There were things that we had agreed as a collective not to do. So we were left with what we have designated as our urban villages. And I will pause to see if Jared wants to add anything before I go on to the second half.
No, go right ahead.
Okay, so that's kind of the first why. So our commercial corridors was where we had come to a collective agreement about where our planning would be. And that's why most of our urban villages are along these very large arterial streets, like South Bascom or Winchester, Stevens Creek, Alum Rock, these Capitol Avenue, these very large streets, because there are existing commercial corridors, and that's where intensification will go. The second half is when we actually do our urban village planning efforts, we do extensive community outreach and engagement, and it does vary over time about what that engagement looks like. At a minimum, we send out public postcard notices. They used to be 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, folded up and put in a white envelope, but we've moved to these new postcards. They're colorful. If you've received them, you'll know what I'm talking about, more like a real estate flyer, to get people's attention and get them involved. And they're sent to every person or property owner and occupant, so resident, renter, leasee within the village boundary, and then within 1,000 feet of said village boundary. We send those notices out. And that can be like 8,000 individuals who are receiving these notices. In addition, we're also sending out information via email. If you sign up for our interest list, we keep people informed, sometimes annoyingly so, to let you know we have a survey we want to do, or we'll go out to events if we get invited, come to the neighborhood groups if we can. And we also host public meetings, which are workshops or more traditional meetings. And then of course, the public hearings that come with that in front of the Planning Commission and City Council for ultimate approval. So if I haven't answered your question, let me know. And yes, we definitely acknowledge not all residents have computer access. The digital divide is real. And we faced it a lot with shelter in place, where we as planning acknowledge and definitely respect that this is something we need to address. And we do try as part of our urban village efforts moving forward and some of our other citywide efforts, we're partnering with local community-based organizations to help us understand our community's needs, because they know how to outreach in addition to traditional posting on Instagram or Facebook or Nextdoor or sending out an email. It doesn't work for all. So our main goal is to diversify the way in which we outreach, to provide as many avenues as possible so that it can get to your attention. Thank you. All right, so we have a couple more questions. The reason I brought this up, and this is the SJSU report on transit-oriented development, is that the Valley Transportation Authorities, or VTA's TOD, transit-oriented development policy, near transit has essentially made it impossible for Caltrain ridership to ever return to Tamian, and Gilroy is next. So this is a comment from Roland, so thank you for that. And you've included a link here. And then Todd's asking who was involved in the collective agreement. So this was, I assume, in reference to the general plan adoption and the grand bargain with the urban village designations. So we had, gosh, Jared, how many people were on the community task force and how many meetings were held?
There were 50 task force meetings held, I believe 34 members on the task force.
Right, and so as part of the general plan adoption and then all of the subsequent maintenance sessions, which are like our general plan 4-year reviews, which one's currently going on, we form a task force of community leaders and interest groups who help the city stay in touch with the needs of the community, and representatives from all over are a part of that and help guide this agreement, the grand bargain, as I mentioned. If you have further questions, please let us know.
Right, and Jennifer was mentioning, kind of the concept behind that is that, you know, we're limited now on where we can grow in San Jose. We're planning for just with growth in the region and with our general plan needing to plan for that future growth out to 2040. We needed to figure out, well, where are we gonna grow? We have this urban growth boundary. We're not really doing the greenfield development like we did in decades past. A lot of the city's industrial land has already been converted. So there, the concept kind of coming out of that process, that general plan, when the general plan was developed, that process was the urban village major strategy, which really focused growth into our commercial corridors and nodes.
Thanks, Jared. So the last comment we have is this map shows all the Caltrain parking lots targeted by VTA. So it's a link to VTA's site. So just a note for staff. So at this time, we do not have any more questions. We have more time, so please do raise your hand. If you're a call-in user, *9 to raise your hand would be great, or feel free to type some more into the Q&A. All right, someone popped in. So it seems like by the time the community receives outreach, many steps are taken like this as preliminary, and when it's rolled out for input, it's already a done deal. Also, the task force was not representative of the real community at large. I don't know if we have any response.
Yeah, I don't know, Jared, if you'd like to respond to those comments.
Yeah, I mean, comment noted. Yeah, with the task force, I know at least with the last 4-year review, the last couple 4-year review task force, the task force have grown to try to include even more members on the task force, which is was good, and then also maybe in some circumstances a little more difficult to manage. But we did have a 43-member task force during this last general plan 4-year review, and it does there's representatives from the environmental community, labor, the development community, and there's representatives chosen from each from each council district. So I know that there is an attempt to make it a well-rounded task force.
Thanks, Jared. So we have some more comments from Roland about the VTA maps. The pink icons are light rail properties. And number 21 is 34 acres surrounding the Santa Teresa light rail station, which is currently zoned for light industrial. And this happened as a result of a swap with iStar with Edenville development area. I think these are just comments, Roland, but we want to make sure we're reading them into the record.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to recognize your comments, Roland, and I am more than happy if you'd like to send me an email. We can kind of follow up on some of the stuff. It's a little bit hard to check on all these links and make it so that everyone can see exactly what we're talking about. But it sounds like you've got a lot of comments and possibly some great ideas. So why don't you also consider sending me an email after this meeting. I will be providing contact information for you so you can follow up with me offline.
Looks like Roland has provided his email in the Q&A as well, Brent.
Okay.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I want to make another call. *9 if you're on the phone, raise your hand at the bottom of the screen or type in a question for Q&A. So nothing new, Brent. I don't know if you want to do, if you have any oh, I lied. All right, we have Elisa. Please unmute.
Hello. how do you update your population growth rate or current projection of population growth? And do we have an idea of how many people are leaving the area and how that's impacted the projected numbers? Because we're talking about projects for urban villages that take big jumps in density, which is hugely appropriate, which should have been happening, but we haven't gotten the intermediate steps in some of these areas, and it's hard to visualize how that's going to work when the project is actually completed, and it's the lone project in an urban village that's still not served by transit of that size, of that caliber.
Thank you.
I can speak to the projection. So yeah, good question. Thank you for that. So the city, a couple ways we would, we receive projections of growth out to future decades. One is, for the during development of the general plan, the city had projections for both residents and jobs prepared. We updated those projections about 4 or 5 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, as part of the previous general plan 4-year review process. The most recent projections that the city has, we also look to, is from our what's called the Association of Bay Area Governments. So they do projections typically every 4 years as part of a regional plan that they create called Plan Bay Area. It's the kind of regional transportation and greenhouse gas kind of reduction strategy for the region. So they've recently released new projections for growth, and I think one of your questions or kind of comments was that about the slowdown of growth in our region, and that is true. Over the last couple of years, the growth has slowed within not only San Jose but the Bay Area at large, largely due to cost of living, as well as kind of declining birth rates. But I think there's still a projection for future growth going out over the next 2 to 3 decades, particularly given the strength of the region's economy. I don't know if anyone else had anything to add to that.
Nope, you got it. We have another question. It sounded like you said the foothills were previously protected and only open areas to target for growth are the urban village areas. Is this correct?
So urban villages are not the only place the general plan plans for growth. So the foothills have been protected. The urban growth boundary has been in place since basically dating back to 1996, and it was approved by voters and codified in 2000. So the general plan plans for growth in a handful of different growth areas. It's one of the major strategies of the general plan it's called the focused growth major strategy. So a component of that is urban villages, as we've been talking a lot about tonight. Some of the other areas where growth is planned is in the downtown, as well as kind of the city's employment areas like North San Jose and Edenville. And then there's also specific plan areas. I think we mentioned Communications Hill. A lot of those areas some of them have been almost fully developed, like the Evergreen specific plan area, but some of them are still developing, like the Communications Hill specific plan. So there's a kind of a handful of different growth areas where most of that growth is focused throughout the city, but certainly the urban village growth areas play a significant role in that.
Thanks, Jared. So we have Elisa again. I'm gonna allow you to speak. Please ask your question.
I'm trying to remember, sorry. So how do the units that have been constructed reduce that number of projected growth and units needed?
Yeah, good question. So the general plan, it plans for 120,000 new housing units, which basically was meant to align with our projected growth out to 2040. So we do track that, in the city is behind in terms of our housing production, in terms of meeting the number of units to meet the demand of our projected growth. We are behind in that metric, but that is a number that we track annually and report out every year. We put out what's called the general plan annual performance review report, where we look at how we're doing, kind of meeting the major strategies of the general plan, and that's one of the metrics that we do track. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Jared. So the last question we have on the Q&A and is asking what the purpose of this meeting tonight was.
So thank you for your question, Todd. The purpose of this meeting tonight is to discuss the proposed urban village and mixed use zoning districts that we went into great detail explaining throughout the presentation.
I'm not seeing any other raised hands or questions in the Q&A. We still have a little bit of time if anyone does have any questions that they'd like to ask. If you're a call-in user, *9, or you can raise your hand by using the raise hand at the bottom of the screen, or the Q&A, you can type out your question.
Hi, Jennifer. This is Leila.
Hi, Leila.
I just wanted to say that I answered some of the general questions that were not specifically about this urban village zoning district. They were mostly about how they can find more information on the site. So if anyone feels that their questions are not fully answered, feel free to just ask questions.
Thank you, Leila. All right, we have 2 more questions. So Shahana, please ask your question.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, this is a continuation of the question I had. See, one of my concerns is that, for builders and developers, it is an immediate cash in hand. I mean, all they are interested in is their bottom line when they build these giant structures or buildings or, redevelopment of areas. Whereas for residents, it is a question of stability and resources and the quality of life. And it is a diametric contradiction to each needs. I mean, I'm talking of the developer versus the resident. And in all your questions and stuff that I've been listening to, I have not seen that being addressed. So if someone would, at least if it can be answered now, maybe later on, but it's an important thing that residents should have a voice in this. Thank you.
So thank you, Shihana, for your comments. I'm not fully sure how to respond to that. You are at a community meeting where you are voicing your opinion, and this is an opportunity where you are giving feedback. So we very much take seriously community input, and I think this is a perfect example of one of those opportunities. And I think, as Martina mentioned earlier, the general plan Envision San Jose 2040 did have an extensive environmental impact report, which covered all of the kind of resource issues that you're talking about. And I would definitely recommend and welcome you to read through our general plan and learn a little bit more about what that scope is. And if Jared or Martina or Jennifer, if any of you have other comments you'd like to piggyback on, please go ahead and feel free to comment as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of philosophical question you're asking. I mean, first, I guess I would say that I don't necessarily agree that every time, the developers' needs and the community's needs are always in conflict. Sometimes they are, and you're absolutely right. A developer can't build something if it doesn't pencil out. They can't get a loan for it. So they do have to look at their bottom line in a way that, me as a planner wish they didn't have to, right? In a perfect world, that wouldn't be an issue. I will say where you didn't see a lot of detail is in things around kind of neighborhood compatibility design, how a building might interact with the street, how it might interact with neighboring properties. And just because you didn't hear it tonight doesn't mean that we didn't address it. Actually, by and large, most of those specific things are addressed in our recently adopted citywide design guidelines. You can actually find those. Probably the easiest way is just Google City of San Jose Citywide Design Guidelines. We also have a link in this presentation so you can get to those. So those do and should hopefully address a lot of that kind of, yes, the developer needs to make money, but we need to make sure the development also has, it fits, it looks good. It addresses some of those things with shade and shadows, where the open space is located, that kind of stuff. You will see that in the design guidelines. I hope that helped add to the response.
Thank you, Martina. All right, we have a raised hand from Gail. Please ask your question. Gail, go ahead and unmute. Thank you.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
So I want to add on to Shahana's comments. I live near the Winchester Urban Village plan, and I don't understand how the developer at 1212 Winchester was advised by the city to lower his project by, I believe, 5 inches. It allowed the setback for my neighbor across the street from me to have this new proposed hotel go from 40 feet behind her fence down to 20 feet. I don't think that's taking the neighborhood into consideration, and a 6-story hotel building that's going on, I believe, 0.69 acres at best, doesn't seem neighborhood appropriate or neighborhood friendly. So there hasn't been a direct way to make our needs known that it's not what the neighborhood would like. So. And having gone to urban village meetings, there was never a mention of 6-story buildings. It was supposed to be, the urban village idea was that things would be neighborhood friendly, walkable, green spaces, and a 6-story hotel right there just seems so inappropriate. So thank you. Anyhow, if you can comment on how we could lower the height, have a bigger setback, that would be what we'd be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, thank you for your comment, Gail. And unfortunately, I did not work on that project, so I'm not really familiar with it. I also did not work on that urban village plan. So if one of my associates would like to comment on that would be helpful.
I can answer this question because I was the project manager for Winchester Urban Village. So Winchester Urban Village have some set heights and densities. So I'm not also familiar with this specific project, but all projects that are within the boundary of Winchester Urban Village has to conform to the approved heights and density that are went to several community meetings, which includes 3 community workshops and 25 Winchester Corridor Advisory Group meetings, and also online surveys for about 2 years. So any project within that boundary has to conform to the set heights and set density. So I'm assuming this project is conforming, and if it's not conforming, feel free to compare it with the approved Winchester Urban Village and let the city staff know.
Thanks, Layla. So there's a couple more questions. I think we're coming up on time, but I think we can get to them. So how would will the input from these meetings affect the outcome of the ordinances?
So thank you for that question. And you know, the point of this meeting tonight is to take feedback. So we are going to be collecting this data, and all of your information will be used to inform this project going forward. We will be providing a staff report and summarizing many of the comments that we've received today as well. I don't know if Martina or Jared would like to also comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to kind of add something that to note is that, again, the scope of this project is introducing zoning that's in conformance with the general plan. So a lot of these issues have kind of already been addressed in the general plan, and it's our job here with this specific project to kind of match what the general plan says with some zoning standards that take the generalities of the general plan and put them in numbers. So again, the general plan says number of stories, and it's our job to figure out, well, what does that equate to in feet and height? So when we're looking at a project, what's the maximum height you can do? So there are certain areas which we are bound, and we're actually bound by state law to do this work. So some of these concerns around the densities and the heights and stuff are really kind of at the general plan level and a little bit out of the scope of this project. So I want to be honest about that. There are some things that we may hear that we may not be able to do. That said, we really still are asking for feedback on this stuff. And as Brent said, these meetings will be recorded, they'll be online. I actually recognize that at least a couple council members, staff who are here tonight listening. So the council makes the ultimate decisions on this. They're hearing you and your concerns, and then this will be summarized in our staff report so council can hear it as well, and planning commission. And this will be adopted at public hearing and considered by council at a public hearing. So that is another opportunity to voice your thoughts directly to the decision makers when they consider this project. But I do want to be clear, there are some areas where we don't have a lot of wiggle room.
Thank you. We have another one about SB 35. So buckle in. San Jose's design guidelines. Is San Jose's design guidelines enforceable when an SB 35 development is being considered, or is the SB 35 override going to override the city's design guidelines?
Do you want me to answer this question, Brian?
Sure, go ahead.
I actually have typed this to Martina, correct me if I'm wrong. So yes, SB 35 projects, they have to conform to all objective standards in the approved citywide design guidelines and standards, and also all other objective regulations, policies, and standards anywhere else in the city, including zoning, any objective policy or standards comes from public works, and any other objective standards in the urban village plans. So feel free to add Martina or
Yeah. And so, to piggyback on what Layla said, the design guidelines were actually written with things like SB 35 in mind. And so they were written to apply objective standards so that SB 35 projects would still be bound by those objective standards. They are considered city policy, as Layla said, so these projects don't get around that. I will tell you though, you do often see SB 35 projects, because in San Jose, those have to include an affordable component to qualify for that law. You do often see them, excuse me, paired with the density bonus, and the density bonus does allow developers of affordable housing, it's a state law, to ask for waivers and concession to standards. And so the design guidelines would be subject to that. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future you see an SB 35 project that combines the density bonus to maybe modify or kind of get out of or change some of those standards that may come from the design guidelines, but it would have to be through that density bonus project. Broadly speaking, they would still apply to SB 35 projects.
Thank you. Brent, I'm going to turn it back to you. We have no more questions.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Okay. So this concludes tonight's meeting, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us and providing your comments and feedback. Your feedback and the recording will be posted on the informational website, hopefully by the end of this week or sometime next week. And if you have additional questions or comments, you are more than welcome to follow up with me directly by email, either at brent.carvalho@sanjoseca.gov or by phone at 408-535-6862. As I said too, we also have an informational website. The link is here. This PowerPoint will be added to that website. When exiting this meeting, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. The survey will automatically open if you do not exit out of your internet browser, and the survey will help improve our virtual meetings in the future. So again, I just want to say I appreciate you taking time to join us tonight. Thank you for participating in our meeting. I hope that everyone stays healthy and have a great night.